guys, today we're going to talk about the MIG welder, which is this machine right here. So with the MIG welder we use gas, and this gas is CO2 and argon. So it's a 75-25 mixture of CO2 and argon. So it's actually 75% argon, 25% carbon dioxide. And over here are our gauges for our tank. So when we turn this tank on, we're actually going to open it up all the way, and we should see that gauge on the right go up. Okay, then we're going to adjust our line pressure, which is how much pressure we're actually giving to the weld. So we're going to turn this T handle here until we get to about 22 pounds of pressure. So slowly turn it. It creeps up there. There we go, there's 22 pounds. All right, so now that goes into our MIG welder. Okay, so this is the inside of the MIG welder. So we can see our wire spool here on the left. That's our wire spool that holds all of our wire. And then you can see at the bottom here that wire runs in to this contraption. We actually have a wire cleaner right here. So as that wire gets pulled through, it drags across that and it cleans it of any debris or dirt. And then it goes through here. This is actually what pulls the wire. So there's tension on these two wheels, pulls the wire through. We have our electric connection down here, so we are getting current through there. And then through this tube right here is where the gas comes in. So we are getting electricity and gas coming through our line. You won't ever adjust anything on here, but if we run out of wire, I usually have students help me replace the wire spool. Okay, so with the MIG welder, we have a couple of parts we want to discuss. First, we have our actual handle and torch. This is the MIG welder nozzle. So we can see the wire that kind of comes through there on the end. And this is our gun with our trigger. So we're going to keep that in that holder there. And then we have our ground clamp, which completes our connection, grounds our work. That runs back over here. So we got both of our lines right here. And then we have our controls. So this is how we're going to set up the machine based on the thickness of steel that we are welding. So we are welding steel with the MIG welder. We can put different wires on there, but for general purpose, we're going to use steel. So over here on the left is our wire speed. So we're going to adjust that based on how much wire we want coming out on our weld. And then we're going to adjust this kind of with that. They'll be kind of adjusted together. So the higher the voltage, the hotter it's going to weld. So the more wire you're going to need if you have a higher voltage. It's just going to melt much faster, so you need to continue to put more metal down. So if you had that very low and the voltage set very high, then you're not going to be able to fill. It's just going to kind of burn as you go. If you have too much wire speed on a low voltage as the opposite end, you're going to have just metal sitting on top and not actually fastening, melting the two metals together. So it won't be a cohesive fastener, it'll just be something sitting on top. Okay, here's some other tools and accessories that you may need. Things that will be over here all the time are the two items here in the middle, which is our nozzle dip that keeps the slag from building up on the nozzle itself. And then we have our MIG pliers. So this is going to be very useful for cleaning the nozzle all the way up to actually cutting the wire. So it's going to be a very useful tool while you're here. So those two will always remain here in the MIG welding station. Then we have on the right the red object there. That is a magnet, so that's for kind of clamping purposes or holding things in place while you're welding. And then on the left side, of course, we have our auto darkening helmet. We have these provided here in the school. You don't have to bring your own, but you must wear a welding helmet. While you are in the welding booth assisting someone, you also have to have a welding helmet on as well. First thing I want to talk about before we actually start welding is what you need to weld. So first, we have to have our safety equipment with our safety glasses and our welding helmet. We have to have a pair of gloves, welding gloves. We have to have our jacket on, a welding jacket or a welding apron would be fine. And then always have your earplugs in, just because we are in the metalworking shop. So everything else around us is going to be noisy, so we need to protect our hearing from everything else. The MIG welder itself isn't very loud, but the hearing protection is for everything else in the shop. I also want to make sure that I've cleaned my metal. So what that means is I've ground away or used a wire wheel to get away that mill scale that's built up on there, or any surface rust or imperfections. So anywhere that you're going to be welding, so if I'm going to weld these two pieces together like this, or if I'm going to do a T-weld, anywhere I'm going to weld, I need to have that cleaned off. So I've gone and cleaned the ends where I might be welding the ends together. I've also cleaned the inside if I'm going to do a butt weld, where I would be welding them together like this. One other thing I wanted to mention about our safety is that we also have this ventilation tank turned on when we're welding. There's a lot of toxic fumes that are created during the welding process, and we make sure we're not inhaling those. So we're turning our ventilation on so it sucks those fumes out. Okay, so I'm going to be welding using the table as my flat surface. This table is not perfectly flat. It has this grate on it, and it tends to be not quite perfectly flat. If I needed something to be perfectly flat, I'd want to take a piece of metal and lay it on top of here, or even a piece of plywood, as long as it was not warped and nice and flat and true. So I'm going to just, for these demonstration purposes, on these practice pieces, I'm going to weld directly on here. The benefit of that, or the benefit of using a piece of metal to make a good flat surface, is that we can take our grounding clamp and ground it to the table itself. That way it still completes the circuit, because the table is metal and conductive, and it's in contact with my workpiece. So as long as that ground clamp is in contact with your workpiece, you're good to go. In situations where you might need to use a piece of plywood or something that's non-conductive, you would want to clamp that directly onto your workpiece that you're welding. I have my gun set up right here. So you can move this, this holder anywhere you need to, just by loosening this nut. Now I have my pliers right here, I have my nozzle dip right here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by dipping the nozzle in. And you're just going to barely get a little bit on the surface, so you can see a little bit of gel on there. And that's just going to help prevent that spatter from sticking and building up on the nozzle itself. Put that over to the side. Alright, so I'm going to try to get a weld here, just running a weld bead along the inside of this piece. And when I put any pressure on it, it's going to move. So I want to have some kind of clamp, some way to fasten it to the table. For today's purposes, I'm just going to put this magnet on here, and now when I push it, that magnet holds it in place. Now I want to keep that wire so that it's only about 1/4 of an inch stick out. So the best way to do that is to take these pliers and use them kind of as a measuring guide and clip off the excess that way. All right, now I've set my tank, my gas pressures, so that I'm at 22 pounds for line pressure. And I've already set that. I'm going to set my voltage and my wire speed. And I'm going to turn the welder on. So now the welder is on. You can hear the fan kind of kick on. You can also see the power light kick on, so you know you have power. So this will not arc just by touching it to your metal. You have to pull that trigger in order to get it arc. Okay? Just before I'm ready to start welding, I'll want to make sure my curtains are pulled closed all the way so that anybody that's working in the shop is not going to be blinded. Alright, so I'm not going to weld anything together for this first weld. I'm just going to weld a straight line so you can see a weld. Okay, so we can see with the MIG welder that we actually have a pretty clean weld. There's not a lot of spatter on there, which means that a lot of things worked well for us. It's not the straightest weld, so you want to try to make sure that when you're welding you get a nice straight bead. Since I'm just running a weld onto a piece of metal, that's not that important. But if I had a seam, I want to make sure that where my seam was, that I made sure it was nice and straight so that I hit the metal on both sides. First, I'm going to make 2 small tack welds. So a tack weld is a temporary weld. It's a very small, very short little weld that's going to just kind of hold it in place and act as my clamp. And that gives me, like I said, a temporary weld hold. I can still manipulate it and adjust it a little bit as needed, but it is going to hold it together. Think of it like putting a piece of tape on. The tape can be removed. The pieces aren't stuck together forever, and it's pretty easy to get rid of. Okay, so the purpose of that is to hold these pieces together without having the need for a clamp. So what I have is 2 very small dots here. Those are my tack welds. So now I can still bend this a little bit if I needed to make that nice and flat. I have to be very careful because if I bend it too much, it will actually break those tack welds. Like that. Okay, so now that I have my tack welds nice and solid, I'm going to come back with what I call stitch welds. So I'm going to do about a 1-inch long weld bead on this end and on this end. So I'm going to kind of go over my small tack welds. Not my best welds. Okay, so here's what we're looking at. We have some inconsistency on the width of our weld. So what that is caused by is inconsistency in our travel speed and in our circles. So if there is a method that works better for you, if you don't like circles, you don't have to do circles. You can do kind of an upside down U, or you can do kind of a zigzag. Whatever motion is kind of an overlapping motion that makes it consistent. Sure, makes a big difference when you can actually see what you're doing. So here I have a much more consistent welds. My circles were better, and I was able to see during my demonstration. I wasn't really able to see those last welds on the backside, trying to get the camera view. But these welds here look pretty nice. The MIG welder will always give you a pretty good, clean looking weld, so it makes you look better. All right, now that I'm done with my welds, I'm going to go ahead and clean up my area. So the only thing that should be here is my nozzle dip and my MIG pliers. I'm going to take my metal and my magnet, and I'm going to put those away. And then I want to make sure that my cords aren't just laying on the floor like this, they need to be wrapped up. I also need to take care of my gas. So we're going to start taking care of the gas first. I'm going to close the tank all the way. And now I'm going to bleed the line. Before I bleed the line, I want to turn my wire speed all the way down so I'm not wasting all the wire. So what's going to happen? I'm going to pull the trigger. My gauge is going to go down. So I hold this and it opens up that gas valve. Pull this, the wire starts coming out, and all my gas that was in the line is now out. So I only wasted about 4 inches of wire. And I'm going to lift that off, throw that away. Make sure you always pick up any loose wires that you cut off, clean up the floor so it's not litter for the next person. Alright, so my gas is completely turned off and shut down. I'm going to turn off the welder itself, and now I'm going to turn off that ventilation. Okay, now I'm ready to wrap my cords up. I'm going to start with the nozzle. And I'm going to give it some very loose wraps around the handle of the MIG welder itself. So I want to make sure that these wraps are nice and loose so I don't kink that liner. If I kink that liner, it's not going to allow that wire to travel through very cleanly. It's not going to allow electricity or gas to flow through very well either. So we want to make sure that that line is not kinked. Okay, now I'm going to wrap up my ground clamp. Very similar. One wrap nice and loose around the handle. And then I'm going to just clip the handle, clip the ground clamp to the handle so that it's nice and loose loops here. Okay, now take my metal,